Alright, so welcome back. It has been a few days and we're going to go ahead and get this sap boiling and start making some syrup. Couple things. There's two ways to do this. So you could either get a big stock pot and put your sap in, get it boiling, and then just kind of wait till it boils down. It's kind of not my favorite way to do it, just because when you get down to the bottom now, you have this small amount of syrup in comparison to the ginormous amount of sap that you started with. So the way I prefer doing it is in a much smaller pot, getting the sap boiling and then let it reduce and then add a little bit more and then let it reduce and add a little bit more, and basically just kind of keep the amount smaller, but you keep it going. I feel like it's just more manageable, and then I just think that works better. And then the other kind of general rule that you need to know is well, there's instruments that you can use to measure the sugar content, and it's kind of like when if you're familiar with making beer, you measure the specific gravity, but you got to have the right equipment. I don't have that equipment, so I think it's a general rule of thumb that if the temperature of the syrup is 7 degrees higher than the boiling point of water where you live, then it's pretty much ready to go. Where I live, water boils at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so I usually shoot for about 207. So what I have here is, I have an instant read thermometer that's going to help me know the temperature of the syrup. And then also over here is 4 gallons of the sap that I've gathered so far. There'll be more coming. We've had a few cool days and a few warm days. Yesterday it was about 60 some degrees and the bags were just busting with sap. So definitely the bigger the temperature swing, the more sap the tree tends to yield. So hopefully we'll get some more, because it takes a lot of sap to make a little bit of syrup. So we're going to start this process. My plan is to put in a time lapse so that we can kind of see what happens. You'll be able to see it's going to start out really clear. We'll get it boiling, and then it's going to boil down, and then we'll add more, and it's going to start getting darker and darker and darker. But because it's so early, the sap tends to be more gold once it boils down. Later in the season, there tends to be more tannins and things like that in the sap, and it tends to be more brown. And I think that's where they grade the syrup. If you're looking at like official syrup making, the gold is like the grade A, the really good stuff. And there's very little maple flavor in it, at least in the ones that come from my trees. But the darker it is, you get, I think you get more maple flavor, but it's not considered quite the same in terms of grade. So there's a whole gradient, and you can see it goes from like gold to dark brown of what the quality of the syrup is. So these are things I learned last year, because I thought I goofed it when my syrup turned out gold. I thought that I had somehow done something wrong, and maybe I need to like caramelize it and get it on the heat longer, but that wasn't the case. It was just actually really good syrup. So no, like I said, very little maple flavor, but it's very, very sweet. It's kind of that thin syrup too that you're used to. Maybe you'll see it at a restaurant if they serve you real maple syrup. It tends to be a little bit more runny than the plastic bottle stuff that we grew up on, right? Aunt Jemima and Log Cabin and those kinds of syrups, they tend to be thicker and gummier, and they're not really maple syrup. So anyhow, I'll stop talking and then we can get to the process of making this. Okay, so let's get this show on the road. I'm going to put a little bit of this maple sap into the pot. Actually, that's a lot. We'll get that. We'll get it covered, and once it's boiling, then we'll wait and get it so that it is a nice rolling boil. Take the lid off. It'll then begin to evaporate. We'll let it boil with the lid off until it just reduces, and then we'll just keep adding little bits at a time. One other thing, a lot of people do this outside because it will give off a lot of humidity. Where I live, it's in Colorado, so it's very, very dry. we don't mind a little extra humidity in the air in the house. It just actually makes it a lot more pleasant. But if you're in an area that's more humid, you're definitely going to want to do this outside. And then you'll just have to get some sort of burner, maybe probably a propane burner attached to a propane tank, and then just do the same process just outside. Yeah, so that's about it. So from this point, I'm going to put on the time lapse, and hopefully it will capture everything that we want to see. And hopefully the GoPro cooperates. I've had mixed luck with time lapses, so we shall see. Catch you later. Alright, it's gotten really late. It's 8 hours later. I've been able to boil down that 4 gallons of sap down to syrup. I stopped boiling at 207 degrees, which is kind of what I said I would do. It's a lot thicker. It's still a little on the runny side, but I think it's where it needs to be. You can probably see from the time lapse the color got pretty gold. I went from the bigger pot down to a smaller one, and when I did it was a little bit easier to see the color change that had taken place. It's very golden color. Just a few things. If you're using sap from sugar maples, it's probably going to be a little bit different process. I'm just using random maple trees in my backyard. All maple trees have sugar content, but they differ in how much. So could be a little bit different process when you get to the boiling stage, and once it starts, the water starts to kind of evaporate. So what I'm going to do is let this cool down, and once it cools down, I'm going to filter it through some cheesecloth and the strainer that you may have seen me use in the time lapse. And then once it's through there, it should be pretty clear. All the scum should be gone from the top, and then there is a sediment that forms called, I think they call it sugar sand, when you're making this, and that should just kind of disappear. So once I have it in that, I'll transfer it to a jar, and then I'll put it in the fridge. I usually do that just because it'll keep pretty good. It's been a real long day, but we finally got our syrup filtered and put into a jar, and there you see 8 ounces of pure gold maple syrup. That's the good stuff, and that's where the gold's at. If you're just catching this part 2 video, there's a link in the description below to see part 1. Part 1 is more about how I gathered the sap, and this is more about how I made the syrup from the sap.
I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. If you could, hit the like button. If you have any questions, leave me a comment below. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. And until next time, I will catch you later.